Imagine that one of the most important things in human history is actually right inside your home. You probably use it every day, but you almost never think about the incredible journey it has gone through. Because there was a time when people used to go to the bathroom right next to where they lived. Then, ancient civilizations began building sewage systems that were so advanced that thousands of years later, engineers are still studying them. The ancient Romans created public toilets where people didn't just take care of basic needs. They discussed news, made deals, and socialized. Yes, for them, the toilet was almost a social network of its time. But then something strange happened. One of the most advanced systems disappeared. Europe forgot many of the sanitation technologies of the past. Cities turned into places where waste could literally lie under people's feet. And in medieval castles, there were toilets that looked like engineering marvels, until you learned where everything actually went. In the 19th century, the situation became so bad that one river in London turned into a giant sewer. The smell was so strong that the British Parliament could not function properly. This event went down in history as the Great Stink. And it was this moment that forced humanity to completely change its approach to hygiene. But the most surprising part, the history of the toilet did not end on Earth. When humans went into space, it turned out that building a rocket is sometimes easier than building a toilet that works in zero gravity. Because in space, there is no gravity, no natural down, and a simple trip to the bathroom turns into a complex engineering challenge. Today, there are toilets that open their lids automatically, regulate water temperature, dry with air. And some space systems cost millions of dollars and were designed for future missions to the moon. But how did humanity go from a hole in the ground to a toilet beyond the planet? Why did this invisible part of our lives save millions of people? And why is the history of the toilet actually the history of civilization itself? Today, we are going on a journey spanning thousands of years, from ancient cities, through Roman empires, medieval streets, the Industrial Revolution, American homes, and finally, into space. This is the story of something everyone uses, but almost no one notices. Imagine London. The year is 1858, a hot summer. You are walking down the street and you smell something that is impossible to ignore. Not just an unpleasant smell, but the smell of an entire city. The River Thames, which was supposed to be a source of life, had turned into a massive stream of waste. Everything ended up there. Water from factories, trash, the waste of millions of people. And the worst part? People were still using this same water in their daily lives. At that moment, the problem became so serious that the British Parliament literally could not function normally. Officials were closing windows, trying to use fragrances, covering their faces with cloth. The city faced what would later be called the Great Stink. And it sounds like a funny historical episode, but in reality, it was one of the most important turning points in human history, because people finally realized sometimes the greatest threat to civilization is not outside its borders, but right beneath its feet. And today, when we walk into a bathroom, press a single button, and never even think about where everything disappears, we are using the result of thousands of years of experiments, mistakes, and engineering solutions. The history of the toilet is the history of cities, the history of diseases, the history of technology, and perhaps one of the most underestimated stories about how humans learned to live together.
Because the toilet seems like something completely modern to us. White ceramic, clean water, a flush button, sometimes even a heated seat and music. But if we traveled back just a few thousand years, we would see a completely different world. A world where the main question was not, how do we make a toilet more comfortable? But how do we make sure waste does not destroy our settlement? For most of human history, people simply did what nature did. They searched for a place away from their homes. A hole, a river, a field, any place where they could leave waste and forget about it. The problem was only one. There were more and more people. Villages appeared, cities appeared, and what once disappeared on its own now remained right next to people. And gradually, humanity understood one simple thing. If you want to build a city, you need to solve the problem of what that city produces every single day. Some of the first amazing examples appeared thousands of years ago. Around 5,000 years ago, in Scotland, there was a settlement called Skara Brae. It was a stone settlement of people who lived long before the creation of modern cities. And the most interesting thing, they already had primitive systems for removing waste. In some houses, there were special channels that helped carry dirt away from the living space. For a modern person, this sounds ordinary. But imagine, the Stone Age. People were not building skyscrapers yet. They had no electricity, no modern tools, but they already understood. Clean living spaces and waste must exist separately. And then one of the most amazing civilizations of the ancient world appears, the Indus Valley Civilization. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro, around 2500 BC. And this is where the story becomes unexpected, because these people built something that many medieval European cities could only dream of. Many homes had their own toilets. They were connected to sewage systems. Covered drains ran beneath the streets. There were carefully designed water drainage systems. It was a true ancient urban engineering project. In fact, thousands of years ago, people already understood. The main secret of a healthy city is not only the walls and buildings, but what exists beneath them. Around the same time, other civilizations were also searching for their own solutions. In Mesopotamia, early drainage systems appeared. Clay pipes helped remove waste. In ancient Egypt, wealthy homes could have special rooms for toilets. Stone structures and drainage systems were used. Of course, this was far from modern bathrooms, but the idea was already the same. Humans began separating themselves from their own waste, and this moment became one of the signs of the development of civilization. But the real breakthrough happened in a place that today is associated with completely different things. Not with toilets, but with roads, armies, and engineering. Ancient Rome. The Romans were masters of construction. They built roads, aqueducts, huge buildings, and most importantly for our story, they created one of the most advanced sanitation systems of their time. Cities had public toilets, large rooms with long stone benches and openings. And here, a modern person might be surprised, because a Roman toilet was not exactly a place for privacy. It was almost a social space. People could sit next to each other, discuss the news, talk about politics, discuss business deals. Today, we close the bathroom door and hope nobody talks to us. But 2,000 years ago, people could calmly conduct business conversations while going to the toilet. But even the Romans had a problem. What did they use instead of toilet paper? The answer was, let's say, unusual. They used an object called a tersorium. It was a sponge attached to a stick. It could be cleaned in water with vinegar or salt water, And yes, in some public places, this system was shared. History sometimes reminds us that our ancestors were incredibly creative, but sometimes it is better not to imagine too much about how exactly some of their ideas worked. However, Rome's most important achievement was not only the toilets themselves, it was the understanding of the system. Waste must be removed. Water must move. A city must have infrastructure. The Romans created something that seems obvious to us today, but back then, it was a true technological revolution. And it seemed like, after that, humanity should have only continued moving forward. But history decided otherwise. When the Roman Empire fell, a large part of its sanitation achievements began disappearing with it, and Europe entered a period when knowledge about cleanliness was almost forgotten. An era began where the toilet once again became one of the biggest problems of human life. The history of humanity sometimes feels like a strange book. In one chapter, people create incredible technologies, and in the next, it is as if someone pressed the reset settings button. And that is exactly what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. One of the most advanced sanitation systems of the ancient world began disappearing. Aqueducts stopped working. Sewage systems fell apart. Cities that once knew how to manage water and waste gradually forgot these skills. And an era began when personal hygiene once again became a massive problem. In medieval Europe, most people did not have what we consider normal today. A separate bathroom, a toilet inside the house, a sewage system. Instead, they used what was available. For example, chamber pots. And this is where one of the most famous and unpleasant stories of the past begins. Because this waste did not simply disappear by magic. It had to go somewhere. And sometimes the easiest solution was to throw the contents directly onto the street. Yes, exactly like that. A medieval city could look beautiful. Stone buildings, markets, churches, castles. But beneath people's feet, there was often a completely different reality. Dirt, trash, waste, smells. There is even a story that before pouring the contents out of a window, people warned those passing below. A phrase like, "Watch out for the water." And if you think about it, this was a very polite way to warn someone, in a few seconds, something much worse than ordinary rain may fall on you from above. But the most interesting thing, people at that time did not understand the main connection. They saw the dirt, they felt the smell, they saw the diseases, but they did not understand that waste and contaminated water were the real causes of deadly epidemics. Diseases seemed like a mystery. People thought maybe it was the air, maybe it was the bad smells, maybe it was something invisible. And a theory appeared that would later become known as miasma theory. The belief was if something smelled bad, then it caused disease. That is why people tried to fight not the cause, but the smell. They carried scented bags, used flowers, burned incense, tried to make the city smell better. But the problem was somewhere else. It was in the water. And if ordinary homes were a problem, then castles looked a little better. But only a little. In medieval fortresses, there were special toilets called garderobes. At first glance, an almost genius solution. A stone seat, a hole, waste goes downward. Some castles even built these toilets directly into the walls. But if you imagine the reality, it was far from modern comfort. Sometimes waste simply fell outside.
sometimes into special pits, sometimes near defensive moats. Yes, those same beautiful moats around castles that we see in movies. The romance of the Middle Ages looks a little different when you know that some parts of the scenery had a very practical purpose.
But there is an interesting point here. Despite all the problems, medieval people were not dirtier simply because they did not care. They lived within the limits of the technologies of their time. If you do not understand bacteria, if you do not have modern pipes, if you do not have treatment facilities, you solve the problem with the tools you have. The history of hygiene is not a story about how people of the past were stupid. It is a story about how slowly humanity learned to understand the invisible world around it. And then a new era arrived, the Renaissance, a time when people started asking questions again. How does the human body work? How does nature work? How is a city built? And together with the development of science, a new idea appeared. What if waste could not just be hidden? What if it could be flushed away? In 1596, English writer and inventor Sir John Harington created a device that became one of the ancestors of the modern toilet. And the most interesting thing, it was invented not by a plumber, but by a man of literature. Harrington created a design with a water tank and a mechanism that allowed waste to be flushed away. He even installed such a system in his own home, and later, a similar device appeared for Queen Elizabeth I. But there was one problem. The world was not ready yet. Because a toilet is not only the toilet itself, it is an entire system. You need pipes, you need sewage, you need a place where everything will go. And in the 16th century, almost none of that existed. The situation was, a person invented the future, but the infrastructure was still living in the past. It was like installing an electric car charger in a city that still has no electricity. The following centuries, humanity continued experimenting. Wealthy homes began installing early water flushing toilets. New designs appeared. Engineers improved the mechanisms. But for most people, life remained the same. Until cities began growing faster than ever before. And then the 19th century arrived. The Industrial Revolution. Factories. Workers. Millions of people moving into cities. But together with the development of civilization, a new problem appeared. Cities began producing too much waste. The system could no longer handle it, and one river in London would soon force the entire world to admit toilets could no longer simply be something people dealt with later. The 19th century. Humanity entered a new era. Factories were operating. Trains connected cities. The population was growing. For the first time in history, people began moving to large cities on a massive scale. It seemed like civilization was only moving forward. But progress had one problem. Cities learned how to produce more, but they did not learn how to properly get rid of what they produced. And at some point, a problem appeared that could no longer be ignored. In 1596, English writer and inventor Sir John Harington created a device that became one of the ancestors of the modern toilet. And the most interesting thing, it was invented not by a plumber, but by a man of literature. Harington created a design with a water tank and a mechanism that allowed waste to be flushed away. He even installed such a system in his own home, and later, a similar device appeared for Queen Elizabeth I. London in the middle of the 19th century was one of the largest cities in the world. Almost 3 million people, thousands of houses, factories, markets, dense urban development. But this enormous system had a weak point: sewage.
It practically did not exist in the modern sense. Many types of waste ended up in rivers, and the main victim became the River Thames. Today, we imagine the Thames as a beautiful river in the center of London. Bridges, historic buildings, tourists. But in 1858, it was a completely different place. During the summer, the heat made the problem worse. The water moved slowly, waste accumulated, and the smell became so strong that people literally could not stay nearby.
This event entered history as the Great Stink. And it sounds almost funny, like the name of some strange movie. But for London, it was a real crisis. The smell was so terrible that even the British Parliament found itself in a difficult situation. Officials tried to close the windows. They used fabrics soaked in chemical substances. They tried to fight the smell. But the problem was obvious. You cannot defeat a problem simply by closing a window.
And this is where history takes an important turn. Because sometimes humanity changes, not when a new idea appears, but when the old way of life becomes impossible. London could no longer wait. A system had to be built. The man who took on this task was engineer Joseph Bazalgette. His idea was simple but revolutionary. Not to try to make people pollute the city less, but to create a system that would quickly move waste to a place where it would no longer be dangerous.
Construction began on a massive sewage network. Thousands of miles of pipes, new pumping stations, special interceptor sewers. It was one of the largest engineering projects of its time, and the result changed the city. London gradually transformed from one of the dirtiest cities in Europe into a much safer place to live.
And here, an important moment appears. Many people think the greatest saviors of humanity are doctors, medicine, and hospitals. And that is absolutely true. But there is another hero that people rarely talk about. The engineer. The pipe. The sewage system. The toilet. Because sometimes a person's life is saved not by a pill, but by something invisible, working beneath the streets. After modern sewage systems appeared, cities began to change. People started better understanding the connection between water and diseases. Outbreaks of dangerous infections decreased. Hygiene stopped being simply a matter of comfort. It became a matter of survival. But even after sewage systems were created, one question remained. What about the toilet itself? Because a good city is only half the solution. The actual mechanism inside homes was needed. And here appears a man whose name still brings a smile. His name was Thomas Crapper, and around him exists one of the most famous myths in the history of plumbing. Many people think Thomas Crapper invented the toilet. But that is not true. Toilets existed before him. Flush systems existed as well. But Crapper played an important role. He was an English plumber and businessman. He manufactured toilets, improved designs, popularized home plumbing. He had several patents connected to improving flushing mechanisms. But why did his name become associated with the toilet? The story here is more interesting than any joke. His company produced plumbing equipment under the name T. Crapper & Co. Later, American soldiers during World War I saw these labels on English toilets, and the word became part of American slang. So a person's name became part of the language, although Crapper himself was not the creator of the toilet. But the true engineering hero often remains unknown. His name was Alexander Cumming. In 1775, he patented one of the most important parts of the modern toilet, the S-shaped pipe, the siphon, the very part that holds water and prevents smells from the sewer from coming back inside. And if you think about it, it is incredible. Every day,
You use an invention created by a person whose name almost nobody knows. It is exactly these small details that make modern life possible.
But now, the toilet began changing not only cities, it began changing homes. And when the Industrial Revolution reached America, a new chapter of history began. A chapter where the toilet became not only a tool of hygiene, but a part of family life. And that is where one of the strangest symbols of American homes appeared. A toilet that many people today consider unusual, but once it was a real solution to a problem.
Pittsburgh Potty, the strange basement toilet that told the story of America. When we imagine a modern home today, we usually think about a beautiful kitchen, a cozy living room, a large bathroom, a place where everything is clean, comfortable, and thoughtfully designed. But if we found ourselves in some American homes from the early 20th century, we might see something very strange. A toilet in the basement, without a separate room, sometimes right in the middle of the space. And no, this was not a construction mistake. It was part of history.
To understand why something like this appeared at all, we need to travel to one of the most important industrial cities in America, Pittsburgh. The late 19th, early 20th century. A city of steel, a city of factories, a city of workers. Here, metal was produced, railroads were built, and heavy industry was developing. Thousands of people came here to work. The city was growing quickly. But with that growth came a problem. The infrastructure simply could not keep up with the number of people.
Many houses were built quickly. Working-class neighborhoods appeared near factories. And some buildings had a unique feature. The main floor was used as living space, and the basement was used for work. There could be tools there, equipment, coal storage, a small workshop.
And this is where the question appears. What do you do if a person spends the whole day working in a dirty industrial environment? If they come home after a shift at the factory? If the toilet is upstairs, but you just came back covered in dust, oil, and coal dirt? The answer turned out to be very practical. Put the toilet where the person takes off their work clothes, in the basement.
This is how the so-called Pittsburgh Potty appeared. A simple toilet, most often open, without walls, without a door, without any special comfort. Today, such an idea seems unbelievable, because a modern person would look at it and say, wait, this was really part of the house? But for its time, it made sense. It was a solution to a specific problem.
And here, it is important to understand, this was not a symbol of poverty or a lack of culture. On the contrary, it was an example of how people adapted. Just like the first toilets in ancient cities, just like Roman sewage systems, just like London's sanitation systems. Every era created its own solutions for its own conditions. Of course, over time, homes changed. Normal plumbing appeared, better layouts, separate bathrooms, and the need for this type of toilet gradually disappeared. But many of them survived. And today, in some old Pittsburgh homes, you can still find this historical greeting from the past. A small toilet that looks almost like a design mistake, but actually tells the story of an entire era. And here is an interesting point. The history of the toilet often shows not only technology, it shows the way people lived. The Roman toilet told the story of urban culture. The medieval toilet told the story of technological limitations. London's sewage system told the story of the fight for public health. And the Pittsburgh Potty tells the story of industrial America, about the people who built cities with their own hands.
But while some countries were solving problems in working-class neighborhoods, another quiet revolution was happening around the world. The toilet was slowly becoming something ordinary. It was becoming a normal part of the home.
In the 20th century, something happened that seems natural to us today. Mass production made plumbing more affordable. Porcelain and ceramic became the standard. Cities began connecting to sewage systems on a massive scale. Building regulations became stricter. And the toilet finally became what we know today. White, clean, predictable.
But along with this came a new challenge. If humanity once tried simply to get rid of waste, now it began thinking about something else. How can we make this process more convenient, more hygienic, more environmentally friendly? New technologies appeared. Automatic flushing, water saving, improved designs, dual flush systems, and gradually, the toilet began transforming from simple plumbing into a technological device.
And then another amazing moment happened. Humans decided to do something that once seemed impossible. They left Earth. And then it became clear. Creating a rocket that flies into space was sometimes easier than creating a toilet that works there. Because on Earth, gravity helps. But in space, there is none.
From smart toilets to space, how humanity learned to use the bathroom beyond Earth.
By the 20th century, the toilet had finally become a normal part of life. What was once a luxury for kings and wealthy homes became a standard feature of almost every modern household. But along with this success, a new problem appeared. When people learned how to make toilets comfortable, they began asking another question. Can we make them even better?
Because the modern toilet is no longer just a bowl with water. Over the past decades, it has transformed into a complex device. Engineers began thinking not only about how to remove waste, but also about comfort, saving resources, and hygiene. Water-saving systems appeared. Dual flushing, more efficient designs, automatic sensors, toilets that understand by themselves when a person has finished using them. And gradually, a new category appeared: smart toilets. Japan especially moved far in this direction. There, the toilet became almost a separate technological culture. Heated seats, automatic lid opening, built-in bidet, air drying, water temperature control, sometimes even music. What was once the simplest and most unnoticed place in the home transformed into almost a small computer. And here, the story takes an interesting turn. For thousands of years, humanity tried to solve one problem: how to make life cleaner on Earth. But one day, people decided, what if we leave Earth? And then it turned out, all the old rules no longer work. Because space does not forgive mistakes. On Earth, we are used to one simple thing. Everything falls down. Water flows down. Waste goes down. Gravity does most of the work for us. But in space, there is no down. And this became one of the strangest engineering challenges of the space age. Creating a rocket? Difficult. Protecting a person from radiation? Difficult. But creating a toilet that works in zero gravity? Also incredibly difficult. During the first space missions, astronauts did not have the toilets we are familiar with today. For example, in programs like Apollo, special systems with bags were used. It does not sound very futuristic. A person is flying to the moon, and the toilet technology looks more like camping equipment. But there was no other option at that time. As space flights developed, the systems became more complex. Real space toilets appeared in orbit. Their task was not simply to collect waste. They had to make sure everything stayed inside the system. Because in zero gravity, a small mistake can become a huge problem.
Modern space toilets use a completely different principle. Instead of gravity, air flows do the work. Special ventilation creates movement. Waste is separated. Solid waste is collected separately. Liquid is stored separately. One of these systems received the name Universal Waste Management System. This is not just a toilet. It is a real engineering complex. The development cost was around $23 million, and it was created specifically for future deep space missions, including flights to the moon. And the most interesting thing, even such an expensive and modern system faces problems. During one mission, the toilet failed. The reason was a ventilation problem, and without ventilation, nothing works in space. Because air there does not just create comfort, it literally helps control waste. Engineers on Earth had to help astronauts remotely. Step-by-step instructions, system checks, repairs in space conditions. Imagine the situation. You are far away from Earth. Around you is a vacuum. Millions of miles of empty space. And your task is to fix a toilet. But there was another problem. Physics. When liquid enters the vacuum of space, it behaves completely differently. Because of the lack of pressure, it begins to evaporate quickly. Evaporation takes away heat. And under certain conditions, liquid can turn into ice right inside the system. Something that seems impossible on Earth becomes a normal engineering challenge in space. And here we can see how far this story has gone. Once, humans simply looked for a place far away from their homes. Then they invented sewage systems. Then they created toilets inside houses. Then they made them smart. And now they design systems that work beyond the planet. But the most interesting part of this story is not even about technology. It is about the fact that the toilet shows the development of humanity itself. Every era leaves its own mark. Ancient civilizations left the first drainage systems. Rome left engineering ideas. The Middle Ages showed the consequences of mistakes. London forced the world to build modern cities. America showed how everyday solutions change together with society. And space proved even the most ordinary human need becomes the most complex task when we move beyond Earth. Today, we rarely think about it. We simply open the door, press a button, and continue our day. But behind this simple action stands a history thousands of years long. A history of people who learned how to live next to each other, learned how to build cities, learned how to protect health, learned how to create technologies. And perhaps the most unexpected conclusion. A civilization is defined not only by what buildings it creates, not only by what machines it builds, but by how well it solves the most ordinary problems of human life. Because sometimes the main symbol of progress is not a rocket, not a skyscraper, not a supercomputer, but a simple thing that most people do not even notice: a toilet.